It was the start of spring break, and the students of Brightwood American University were excited. A small group of friends planned a trip to the mountains for the weekend. Among them were Godson, a brave and cheerful boy, Ari, a quiet but smart girl, and Chimi, the funny one who always made people laugh. Along with them were a few other classmates who just wanted to enjoy the break. The trip was supposed to be fun, simple, and safe. They carried food, tents, sleeping bags, and cameras. Everyone was excited about hiking in the forest and sitting around the campfire at night. The mountain they chose was far from the city, surrounded by thick trees and strange silence. The local people warned them not to stay there after dark because of old legends about giants of the shadows, but the students only laughed. They thought it was just a scary story told to frighten visitors. When they reached the forest, the air felt colder, and the trees looked older than time itself. The path was narrow and dark even during the day. Chimi joked about monsters jumping out of the trees, and everyone laughed. Ari, however, felt a little uneasy. She kept looking at the tall rocks, as if something was watching them. By evening, they finally found a flat ground near the foot of the mountain to set up their camp. They built a fire, cooked food, and started singing songs. Godson told stories, and everyone laughed at Chimi's silly jokes. For a moment, it felt like the perfect trip. But then, as the fire burned low and night covered the forest, Ari suddenly froze. She thought she saw something on the mountain wall, a huge, moving shadow of a giant, taller than any tree. She blinked, and it disappeared. Nobody else noticed. Ari stayed quiet, but deep inside, she felt the shadow had chosen her. The night in the forest grew colder, and the fire began to fade into glowing red ash. Most of the students had already crawled into their tents, leaving only Godson, Ari, and Chimi awake. Godson was humming softly, and Chimi was telling a funny story, but Ari sat very still, staring at the mountain wall. Her eyes followed the dark shape that seemed to stretch across the rocks. It looked like a giant's shadow, long arms, wide shoulders, and a head that touched the sky. Ari blinked again and again, but the shadow remained. Then, slowly, it began to move, sliding down the rocks like liquid darkness until it reached the ground. Ari shivered. She wanted to scream, but no voice came out. The shadow moved over the fire and finally covered her body. It felt like ice touching her skin. She gasped for air as her chest tightened. For a moment, everything went silent. The wind, the fire, even the sound of insects. Godson noticed Ari's pale face. "Are you okay?" he asked, standing up quickly. Chimi laughed and said, "She's just scared of the dark." But Ari didn't reply. She held her arms tightly, feeling something strange crawling under her skin, like cold veins spreading through her body. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost broken. "I'm fine, just tired," she whispered. But deep inside, she knew something had entered her. Her heart beat in a strange rhythm, and her eyes seemed darker than before. Godson helped her back to the tent, worried but unsure of what was wrong. Soon, everyone went to sleep, but Ari lay awake. She felt a burning mark on her arm, shaped like a giant's hand. She rubbed it, but it would not fade. Ari closed her eyes, but in her mind, she heard heavy footsteps echoing in the forest and a deep voice whispering her name. The shadow had chosen her, and there was no way back. The forest was silent except for the sound of crickets. Most of the students were asleep in their tents, but Chimi woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. She had heard something, soft whispers, almost like someone calling her name. At first, she thought it was a dream, but the sound came again. "Chimi, Chimi," the voice hissed, low and cold. She sat up nervously and looked around. The moonlight shone faintly through the trees, and the fire had almost died. Chimi peeked outside her tent and saw Eri standing near the forest, her back turned to the camp. Eri was whispering to herself, her head tilted strangely, as if listening to someone who wasn't there. "Hey, Eri," Chimi called softly, half annoyed, half scared. "What are you doing out here?" Eri didn't reply. Instead, she slowly turned her head, and her eyes gleamed in the moonlight, cold and empty. For a second, Chimi froze. Her friend didn't look normal anymore. Before she could run, Eri lifted her hand, and the shadow of a giant hand stretched across the ground, reaching for Chimi. The darkness wrapped around her like ropes, squeezing tightly. Chimi gasped, her voice breaking into a scream, but no one woke up. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the sound. Moments later, Chimi's body fell to the ground, twisted unnaturally. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open in terror. The giant's shadow melted back into Eri, who stood there silently, her lips curling into a strange, broken smile. When morning came, the students discovered Chimi's body near the trees. Everyone screamed in horror. Some said she had fallen, others thought a wild animal had attacked her. But Godson noticed something strange. There were no animal marks, no blood, only a dark hand-shaped mark on her neck. Eri cried with the others, pretending to be shocked. But inside her heart, she heard the shadow whispering again. One death was not enough. The night had only begun. The sun was high in the sky, but the camp felt heavy with silence. Everyone was shaken by Chimi's death. The group sat around the dying fire, their faces pale with fear. Some whispered about calling for help, but the mountain was far from the nearest town, and no phone signal reached this place. "We need to stay calm," Godson said firmly, trying to lead. "Maybe it was an accident. Maybe she went too close to the forest at night." But deep inside, he did not believe his own words. He had seen the mark on Chimi's neck, large, dark, like the fingers of something inhuman. Some students agreed with him, but others argued. "No animal kills like that," one of them muttered. It was something else. The group's fear grew, and everyone began blaming each other. Eri sat quietly among them, her face pale but calm. She cried a little, but when no one looked, a strange smile flickered on her lips. The shadow inside her was growing stronger, and she could feel its hunger. That afternoon, while everyone tried to stay close together, Godson noticed Eri acting strangely. She didn't eat anything. Her hands trembled slightly, and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she whispered into the empty air as though someone stood beside her. "Eri," Godson asked gently, "are you okay? Do you want to talk?" Her head snapped up too quickly, and her eyes looked darker than before. "I'm fine," she said sharply, almost angrily. Godson stepped back. Something was wrong with her, and he knew it. But he kept quiet because the others would not believe him without proof. That night, as the fire burned low again, shadows around the camp stretched unnaturally long, even though there was no wind. Fear crawled into every tent. The students tried to sleep, but one thought haunted them all. If Chimi died in the night, who would be next? The second night in the forest was worse than the first. Everyone was afraid to sleep. They sat close to the fire, their eyes scanning the trees for movement. The laughter and jokes that filled the first day were gone. Now only silence and fear remained. As midnight came, the wind grew stronger. Strange sounds echoed through the forest, low growls, heavy footsteps, and whispers carried by the air. Some students thought it was just animals, but Godson felt the truth. Something unnatural was among them. Suddenly, one of the students, Michael, stood up to get water from the stream nearby. "I'll be quick," he said nervously. The others begged him not to go alone, but he laughed weakly and walked away. Minutes later, they heard his scream. Everyone rushed, but when they reached the stream, Michael was gone. Only his backpack lay near the water, soaked and torn. The ground showed no footprints, just one enormous shadow, stretched across the rocks, then fading into nothing. Panic spread. Some wanted to leave immediately, but the path back was too dark and dangerous. They had no choice but to wait for morning. Back at the camp, Eri sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the fire. No one noticed the faint smile tugging at her lips. Inside her, the shadow whispered, hungry for more. As the night dragged on, another student vanished. This time, his body was found hanging from a tree, eyes wide open, his face frozen in terror. The group broke down, some crying, others shaking. Godson looked at Eri again. Her face was calm, too calm for someone who had just lost another friend. He felt his suspicion grow stronger. By dawn, 3 students were dead or missing. The survivors were broken, terrified, and sleepless. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew this was no accident. Something was hunting them, something connected to Eri. The camp was no longer a place of safety. Fear ruled every heart, and the survivors could barely look at each other. Godson, who had been quiet since the last death, finally spoke with determination. "We can't ignore this anymore," he said firmly. "Something is inside Eri. I've seen it with my own eyes." The group turned to look at Eri. She sat by the fire, her head lowered, her hair falling over her face. At first, she seemed weak, almost harmless. But then, as the flames flickered, a massive giant's shadow rose behind her, taller than the trees. Everyone gasped in horror. Eri lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were no longer human. They glowed faintly, filled with darkness. "You can't stop it," she whispered, her voice deep and broken. "The shadow has chosen me. You will all feed it." One of the students tried to run, but the shadow stretched across the ground, grabbing him like a giant hand. His scream echoed as his body was crushed and thrown aside. Blood stained the grass. The others scattered in panic. Godson grabbed a burning stick from the fire and shouted, "Eri, fight it. Don't let this thing control you." For a moment, Eri's face softened. Her lips trembled, and her human voice came through. "Help me, please." But then the shadow roared inside her, twisting her expression into something monstrous. The ground shook with heavy footsteps no one could see. The trees bent as if giants were moving through them. The students fell to the ground, terrified. Godson stood his ground, holding the fire high. He knew he was facing not just Eri, but the ancient curse itself, the shadow of giants. It was the final confrontation, and only one side would survive the night. The forest was in chaos. Shadows twisted between the trees, stretching like giant arms. The students screamed and ran in every direction, but none of them were fast enough. One by one, the dark hands caught them, crushing their bodies or dragging them into the trees where their voices vanished forever. Godson stood frozen, holding the burning stick as his only weapon. His heart pounded, but he refused to give up. "Eri, fight it," he shouted again, hoping her human side could still hear him. For a brief second, Eri's face changed. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "I don't want this. I don't want to hurt you." Her hands trembled, and the giant's shadow flickered weakly, as if losing its strength. But then, the voice of the curse thundered inside her. "You're mine." The shadow grew larger, swallowing her completely. Eri's cry turned into cruel laughter, echoing through the forest. Godson knew he had only one chance. He threw the burning stick directly at Eri. Flames spread across her clothes, and she screamed in both pain and rage. For a moment, it looked like the fire might destroy the shadow. But then, the flames went out unnaturally, as if the darkness itself swallowed them. The ground shook, and trees cracked like bones. The giant's shadow rose to its full height, blocking the moon. Godson ran, his legs burning with exhaustion. Behind him, Aries' voice called out, half human, half monster, "You can't escape me, Godson." He ran until the forest thinned and the first light of dawn touched the horizon. As the sun rose, the shadow faded, and Aries' laughter died away. Godson collapsed on the ground, the only survivor. When he looked back, the forest stood silent, hiding its horrors once again. But deep in his heart, Godson knew the curse was not gone. Aries was still out there, waiting for the next night, waiting for new victims. The shadow of giants had not ended, it had only begun. And that was the terrifying story of the Shadow of Giants. A trip meant for fun turned into a nightmare, leaving only Godson alive. But even he knows, the shadow is still out there, waiting for its next victim. Warning: if you were in that forest, would you survive the night? Tell me in the comments below. If you enjoyed this horror story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more scary tales to life and maybe, just maybe, keep the shadows away from your door tonight. Thank you for watching. And remember, the giants are watching. Bye.